There are moments in history when two men meet, and the world around them changes forever. Sometimes those moments happen on battlefields soaked in sacrifice, sometimes in grand halls filled with flags and cameras, and sometimes silently in a small room where the air is filled not with applause, but with the weight of decisions that could shape the future of humanity. One such moment occurred when Joseph Stalin met General Dwight D. Eisenhower for the very first time, a meeting not just between two leaders, but between two worlds, between dictatorship and democracy, suspicion and alliance, power and humility. The world had survived the most destructive war in human history. Nations were wounded, cities burned, millions of families shattered. World War II had taken more lives than any conflict before it. The world was desperate for peace, desperate for healing, desperate for leadership that could rebuild ruins and protect fragile hope. And in the midst of this fragile post-war atmosphere, two figures emerged as towering symbols of opposite philosophies: Stalin, the iron ruler of the Soviet Union, and Eisenhower, the humble general who commanded the Allied forces of the West. This was not a meeting of friends. It was not a meeting of equals in ideology. It was a meeting where mistrust sat at the table like an uninvited guest, where every word carried the weight of consequences, where the past was shadowed by war and the future by uncertainty. Yet the world waited to hear. What would Stalin say after meeting the man who had led the invasion that helped end Hitler's empire? History tells us that Stalin was a leader who rarely revealed his feelings. He was known for silence, for cold calculation, for decisions that were more steel than soul. He trusted almost no one, and he feared betrayal more than defeat. But after meeting Eisenhower, something unexpected happened. Those around him recorded something rare, a moment where the brutal Soviet leader spoke openly, even emotionally, about another man. The meeting took place shortly after the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Europe was a broken landscape of rubble, refugees, and ruins. Eisenhower arrived not wearing the pride of victory, but carrying the heaviness of what victory had cost. He had seen what war truly looked like. Young soldiers who never returned home, towns that had been erased, survivors whose eyes told stories that words could never express. His strength was not the strength of intimidation, but the strength of restraint, of someone who won power but never worshipped it. And when Stalin saw him, he saw something he did not expect. Eisenhower did not bow or shrink. He also did not boast or demand. Instead, he greeted Stalin with sincerity, with calm respect, with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his place through sacrifice rather than politics. Their handshake was firm, but without theatrics. It was a handshake between two leaders who had fought the same enemy, but had entirely different visions of the world. Those present described the room as tense at first. Soviet officers watched every move. American advisors stood silently, their eyes alert. Here were two military giants, two global forces, two men carrying nations on their shoulders. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence itself felt like history holding its breath. And then Stalin spoke, not with the thunderous tone he was known for, but with an unexpected gentleness. He said something that surprised everyone, something that would later be repeated across the world. He said that he did not merely respect Eisenhower, he admired him. He admired his discipline, his leadership, and most of all, his humility. Stalin, who trusted no one, said that Eisenhower was the only allied commander he truly believed understood the real cost of war. He said, "This is a man who does not love war. This is a man who carries victory as a burden, not as a crown." It was shocking. Stalin, the iron dictator, praising an American general in a time where the seeds of the Cold War were already beginning to form. It was more than uncommon. It was extraordinary. He went further. Stalin compared Eisenhower to the great generals of history, not because of his power, but because of his restraint. He said that Eisenhower had something rare, the ability to win without needing to humiliate, the ability to lead without needing to dominate. Stalin told his advisors that Eisenhower was a man who understood respect, and therefore a man who deserved it. And then Stalin said something that stunned even his closest circle. If all leaders carried themselves as he did, perhaps the world would never see another war. These words did not come from softness. They came from fear not of Eisenhower, but of what the next conflict could bring. Stalin knew that the future was unstable. He knew that the alliance built during war was already beginning to fracture in peace. He knew that friendship between nations is often temporary, but respect can last longer than treaties. Stalin's advisors later said that he spoke about Eisenhower not as an enemy, not as a rival, but as a man he could sit across a table from and negotiate without deception. For a leader who had spent years surrounded by mistrust, paranoia, and political violence, this moment was rare enough to become historic. And Stalin said something else, something deeper, something personal. He said, "Eisenhower is a soldier who knows what war takes from the souls of men." That sentence carried more weight than any victory speech. It was the recognition that war is tragedy, not triumph. That real leadership is not measured by applause, but by how much pain a man carries without letting it turn him cruel. For Stalin to admit admiration was unusual. For Stalin to speak about another leader with emotion was almost unbelievable. Yet his words reflected what the world needed to hear, that healing might be possible, even after a war that shattered millions of lives. Eisenhower, too, later said he was surprised. He sensed sincerity behind Stalin's words, but he also sensed danger. The danger of diplomacy wrapped in compliments. He knew that the peace that followed war can sometimes be the most fragile battlefield of all. But for a moment, just two men stood together, not as enemies, not yet as cold rivals, but as soldiers who had survived the same storm and now faced the uncertain dawn of a world trying to rebuild. For the people of the world, this meeting meant hope. If two leaders with such different visions could sit together peacefully, then maybe peace itself was possible. Maybe humanity could learn instead of repeat. Maybe the future would not be built on fear. But history had other plans. Because behind the respectful words and polite smiles, something else was growing: suspicion, ambition, a new kind of war, not with guns or tanks, but with secrets, threats, and ideology. The Cold War had already begun, silently, and soon this brief moment of respect would be swallowed by conflict, distrust, and a race for power that would push the world to the edge of destruction. Yet this moment, this first meeting, remained unforgettable, because what Stalin said about Eisenhower revealed more than admiration. It revealed fear, respect, and a rare glimpse of humanity inside. A man history remembers as harsh and unforgiving. It revealed that even the hardest hearts recognize real leadership. And it showed that sometimes the strongest leaders are not those who conquer, but those who understand the real price of victory. The meeting was over. The cameras had stopped clicking. The reporters had been escorted out. And the sound of polite diplomatic applause faded into the cold air outside. The polished smiles that both Stalin and Eisenhower had displayed. For the world dissolved as reality settled back onto their shoulders like the weight of stones. The world saw only two leaders shaking hands, but the men standing closest to them knew something far more significant had transpired. It was not merely a ceremonial encounter between two wartime allies. It was an unexpected moment of mutual recognition between two men who understood the true cost of leadership. As Stalin walked back through the echoing corridors of the Soviet building, surrounded by military officers and political advisors, the silence around him was heavy enough to feel like pressure on the chest. No one dared speak first. They were waiting to hear the verdict, the judgment, the analysis, the command. Every meeting mattered in the fragile aftermath of war, but this one mattered more than most. Stalin had a reputation for turning quiet moments into storms, for dismantling reputations in seconds, for dissecting the character of men with surgical cruelty. And so his advisors braced themselves, expecting either harsh criticism or immediate suspicion. When the doors closed behind them and Stalin removed his gloves with slow, deliberate hands, he sat down without speaking. His eyes were distant, unfocused, not in confusion, but in concentration, as if he were trying to process something unexpected. Then, in a voice so calm it startled the room, Stalin said that he had not met the man he expected to meet. He said he had prepared to face a general intoxicated with victory, a proud commander swollen with triumph, a symbol of Western boastfulness and military pride. But instead, he found humility. He found quiet strength. He found something he rarely saw in others: sincerity. Stalin leaned back in his chair and whispered that Eisenhower was not a man shaped by glory, but a man shaped by grief. He said that Eisenhower carried war not like a metal pin to his chest, but like a shadow he could not escape. He said he had never seen a general with eyes like that, eyes that had seen too much death to celebrate victory. The men in the room exchanged uneasy glances. None of them knew how to respond. Stalin was not a man who spoke in admiration. He did not praise. He did not compliment. For years, silence and fear had been the language of his leadership. Yet here, he was speaking about another man, almost with respect. Respect that sounded dangerously close to reverence. Stalin's voice deepened as he explained that Eisenhower reminded him of a truth he wished he could forget, that victory is not a crown of triumph, but a graveyard of memories. He said the world outside applauded generals for winning battles, but they never understood the weight carried by those who had to order young men to die. He said that victory is not celebration. Victory is thousands of letters, delivered to mothers who will cry for the rest of their lives. For a long time, Stalin said nothing more. He rested his elbows on the table, pressed his hands together, and stared at the wooden surface as if he could see ghosts carved into the grain. Then he looked up, and in a voice stripped of his usual steel, said something no one in that room expected to hear. Eisenhower was the only Allied commander he felt truly understood the real burden of war. He said that in Eisenhower's presence, he sensed the presence, not of a conqueror, but of a mourner. And then Stalin spoke a sentence that would later be written in memoirs and recalled by witnesses with disbelief, a sentence that revealed a rare window into the heart of a man history rarely allowed to appear human. Stalin said, Eisenhower is a soldier who carries victory as a burden, not as a trophy. The men in the room shifted uneasily. These words were too unusual, too vulnerable, too real. Stalin had spent years surrounded by enemies he could not trust, by advisors who feared his unpredictable temper, by commanders who obeyed out of survival, not loyalty. But in Eisenhower, he saw a man who did not need to inspire fear to command respect. Stalin stood up from his chair and began pacing slowly, every step echoing through the silent room. He said that if he had generals like Eisenhower, men driven by duty rather than ambition, men who understood sacrifice rather than worshipped power, then perhaps he would sleep at night instead of lying awake, waiting for betrayal. It was the closest Stalin had ever come to admitting loneliness, and those around him could feel the vulnerability in his words, even if they pretended not to notice. As he stopped pacing, Stalin turned abruptly toward his military marshals and declared that the greatest threat to the Soviet future was not American weapons, not the Allied military machine, not aircraft carriers or nuclear experiments or economic strength, but men like Eisenhower, men who inspired trust, men who commanded loyalty without force, men who could unite people not through fear, but through faith. He said the Western world would follow Eisenhower because people believe in him. He said that a leader who listens is more dangerous than a leader who commands. And then Stalin said something prophetic, something history later proved correct, that if Eisenhower ever left the battlefield and stepped into politics, he would become unstoppable. One of Stalin's advisors asked cautiously why he believed this. Stalin turned his head slowly and said that a man who knows how to carry pain is far more powerful than a man who knows only how to inflict it. He said Eisenhower did not appear as a man hungry for authority, and that ironically made him more dangerous than any ambitious politician. People trust those who do not chase power. People fear dictatorship, but they admire humility. Stalin understood that charisma could move nations, but humility could move humanity, and that is what frightened him. But admiration was not the only emotion stirring beneath Stalin's calm exterior. There was fear, not panic, not weakness, but a strategic fear that saw the future unfolding like a map on the table. Stalin said that though the war was over, new struggle had already begun. It would not be fought with tanks across open fields or battleships in the oceans. It would be fought in whispers, in secret negotiations, in alliances formed behind closed doors. It would be fought through ideology, through influence, through loyalty. He said the next war would be a war for minds, not land. A war for belief, not territory. A war where the most dangerous weapon would not be bombs, but trust. Stalin then said that America had gained something priceless at the end of the war. Not resources, not military superiority, not political leverage, but the moral advantage. The world saw America as the liberator, the rescuer, the defender of the oppressed. And Stalin knew that public perception could become a weapon more powerful than any army. He said that the Soviet Union might win battles on land, but lose the battle for global respect, and that respect could shape the next century. If the world trusted Eisenhower, they would trust the nation behind him, and that meant the Soviet Union would risk standing alone. The room grew colder. Stalin's voice hardened again, the brief softness disappearing like frost melting in sunlight. He warned his advisors that no alliance was eternal, that cooperation during war did not guarantee friendship in peace, and that the Western powers would soon turn from allies into rivals. He said that smiles exchanged over diplomatic tables were masks worn only to buy time. He said that peace was merely a quiet battlefield where the weapons were invisible, but no less deadly. Those listening felt the shift immediately, the warmth of admiration cooling into calculation. Stalin had already begun planning for conflict before the war had even finished settling into history books. But then Stalin said something almost contradictory, something that revealed the emotional complexity beneath his strategic exterior. He said that despite everything, he respected Eisenhower because he saw in him a reflection of the man he once wished he could be. A leader shaped by duty rather than fear, by conscience rather than control. Stalin paused as though the words were difficult to say, and then he whispered that Eisenhower reminded him of the kind of leader the world desperately needed, and perhaps the kind of leader he could never become. One of the generals in the room dared to ask what Stalin thought Eisenhower truly wanted. Stalin answered slowly that Eisenhower wanted peace, not temporary peace negotiated with threats, but real peace built on understanding and responsibility. He said Eisenhower fought not to expand power, but to protect human dignity. He said Eisenhower was a builder, not a conqueror, and Stalin admitted that such a man was harder to defeat than any general who saw war as a path to glory, because glory fades, but respect endures. Stalin said that Eisenhower's strength was not in weapons, but in restraint, the kind of restraint that made his power even more formidable. He said that a man who refuses to misuse power is more dangerous than a man eager to show it. And then he delivered one of the most striking lines his advisors ever heard him say. A leader who does not love war is the leader most capable of winning. 1. Because such a leader fights only when necessary, and when he fights for something real. The room remained silent long after Stalin finished speaking. No one dared contradict him. No one dared agree too enthusiastically either. They simply absorbed his words, uncertain whether they had just witnessed admiration, fear, confession, or strategy. Perhaps it was all of them tangled together. Stalin finally dismissed the room, and his advisors left quietly, carrying with them the shock of what they had heard. Behind the closed doors, Stalin sat alone for a long time. He removed his military cap and stared out the window into the dark night sky. Outside, the city of Moscow slept uneasily beneath the quiet hum of a nation recovering from devastation. Stalin thought of the millions who had died, the cities destroyed, the families broken forever. He thought of the cost of survival and the greater cost of victory. For the first time in many years, something stirred inside him that looked almost like regret. He thought about Eisenhower's eyes that carried pain without bitterness, strength without arrogance, leadership without cruelty. And for a brief moment, Stalin wondered what kind of world might exist if men like Eisenhower led it together instead of preparing to divide it. But hope is a dangerous thing, and Stalin had learned long ago to kill it before it grew. And so the moment passed. The meeting that had seemed promising ended not in friendship, but in the quiet birth of tension that would soon stretch into the long shadow of the Cold War. A war without gunfire, but heavy with fear. A war without trenches, but surrounded by nuclear silence. A war shaped not by armies marching across continents, but by ideologies fighting for control of the human mind. A war that would last for decades. A war that would push the world to the edge of destruction. But none of that happened overnight. In the days following their meeting, the world still believed in peace. Newspapers printed stories of unity. Politicians celebrated cooperation. Ordinary people dared to feel hope again. And maybe if history had broken differently, maybe if trust had been stronger than suspicion, maybe if empathy could have defeated ambition, the world might have taken a different path. But destiny is not always shaped by goodwill. Sometimes it is shaped by fear, and fear had already begun its quiet march. And yet, one thing remained, something no conflict could erase. The human truth spoken in a private room when the world was not watching. Stalin said that Eisenhower was a man he could negotiate with honestly. A man who would keep his word. A man who would choose morality over manipulation. A man who might change the world, not through force, but through integrity. Stalin did not often believe in goodness, but for a brief moment, he believed in the possibility that it might exist in another man. And perhaps that is why the world remembers this meeting. Not because it ended a war, not because it forged an alliance, but because it revealed that even in the darkest chapters of history, respect can rise between enemies, and humanity can survive where politics fails. Two men who stood on opposite sides of ideology recognized each other not through power or propaganda, but through the unspoken language of shared grief. The grief of leaders who understood that every decision they made was paid for in human lives. The world would soon change again. The war had ended, but a colder and more fragile war was already beginning to grow beneath the surface. The next chapters of history would not be written with weapons, but with warnings. Not with battles, but with threats. Not with alliances, but with secrets. And what happened after this meeting would set the stage for decades of rivalry that shaped the modern world. But before the world entered this new era of silent conflict, one final moment remained. A moment that would change everything about how Eisenhower saw Stalin, and how Stalin would shape his strategy for the future. For in the quiet after their first meeting came the private reflections and personal reactions that revealed more than any official account ever could. And it is in those private reflections that the real story continues. The days that followed their first meeting were quiet on the surface, but underneath that silence, both nations trembled with uncertainty. Newspapers printed optimistic headlines about cooperation, unity, and the promise of lasting peace. Leaders posed for photographs, diplomats exchanged toasts, and the world took a deep breath, believing that after years of devastation, the worst was finally behind humanity. But behind locked doors and guarded borders, a new storm was forming, one far less visible, but far more dangerous than any the world had ever known. It was a storm made not of gunfire or bombs, but of suspicion, fear, and the invisible lines drawn between ideologies that refused to coexist. Stalin's words about Eisenhower continued to echo long after the meeting ended, not only among his advisors, but inside his own mind. Something about that conversation had unsettled him, not because Eisenhower had threatened him, but because he had not. Stalin was a man who trusted no one. Betrayal had carved its way through his life like a knife through soft clay. He had survived revolutions, purges, plots, and wars by believing that trust was a luxury reserved for fools. And yet, for the first time in many years, he had met a man who did not wear a mask. A man who spoke not to manipulate, but to communicate. A man who carried leadership not as a crown, but as a wound. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away. Eisenhower returned to his quarters after the meeting, equally reflective, equally affected, though for entirely different reasons. He was not a man easily shaken, but something about Stalin's presence left him unsettled, not frightened, but troubled in a way that forced him to confront the deeper cost of war. Eisenhower understood that alliances formed under the pressure of conflict rarely survived the peace that followed. He knew that victory brought not just relief, but consequences often more dangerous than the war itself. As he sat alone in silence, he replayed every moment of the conversation, every tone, every gesture, every pause loaded with meaning. He had seen leaders full of arrogance, men intoxicated with power, commanders hungry for glory, but Stalin was something different, not weak, not emotionless, unsure, but haunted. Stalin was a man shaped by fear far more than ambition, a man who saw the world not through hope, but through threat. A man who believed survival required control, so absolute that even loyalty could not be trusted. Eisenhower leaned back and shut his eyes, realizing something that chilled him. While the war had physically ended, the psychological war had only just begun. Peace was fragile not because of weapons, but because of fear, fear that lingered like smoke after a fire. He understood that the greatest battlefield ahead would not be fought across continents, but across beliefs. He knew that ideology could be as dangerous as artillery. He knew that a world divided by mistrust could collapse far faster than a world divided by geography. And for the first time since victory, Eisenhower felt a heaviness that victory could not lift. He wondered how many more lives would be lost not to war, but to the inability of men to trust each other after war. Back in Moscow, Stalin found himself pacing in his office late into the night. His staff had left, the hallways were silent, and the city outside was wrapped in winter darkness. He looked out over the sleeping landscape and felt the weight of leadership pressing against his chest like iron. He thought about the millions who had died under his command. He thought about the streets filled with widows, the homes filled with silence, the children growing up without fathers, the vast emptiness carved into the soul of his nation. And he wondered, though he would never admit it, whether history would ever forgive him. But vulnerability was a dangerous thing, and he allowed it only for seconds before locking it away again behind stone walls. He poured himself a glass of vodka, but did not drink it. Instead, he stared at the glass, trembling faintly against the weight of his hand. He remembered Eisenhower's quiet tone, his steady gaze, his honesty without strategy, and he asked himself the question he feared most. What if he had misjudged the world? What if power was not strengthened by fear, but weakened by it? What if leadership rooted in terror was destined to collapse under its own weight? He shook the thoughts away like cold water thrown on flames. Doubt had no place in survival. He had climbed too high, fought too fiercely, sacrificed too much to allow vulnerability to guide him now. And yet, the thought persisted, soft but relentless, that perhaps the world needed another kind of leadership, one defined not by domination, but by understanding. The next morning, Stalin summoned his closest advisors. He told them that the world was entering a dangerous new era where alliances could shift overnight and loyalty could evaporate like breath in winter air. He warned them that the United States would soon emerge not just as a military giant, but as a symbol of moral authority, and that this moral authority could reshape the world more dramatically than any weapon. He insisted that the Soviet Union must prepare, not for peace, but for a conflict disguised as peace. A conflict where influence would matter more than armies. A conflict where trust would become the strongest currency of power. And he repeated his fear, though not in the language of fear, that Eisenhower might become the most influential man on earth. His advisors listened in stiff silence. Some nodded with agreement. Others exchanged cautious looks. None dared contradict him. Stalin ordered intelligence reports, political evaluations, psychological analyses, and strategic calculations concerning Eisenhower and the United States. He said that the Soviet Union could not afford to underestimate a leader who inspired loyalty rather than demanded it. He said that the ability to unite people through hope was more dangerous than the ability to force them through fear. And then, in a rare admission, he said that Eisenhower was a man he respected not as an ally, but as an adversary worthy of calculation. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was absorbing the same truth from the opposite direction. He understood that cooperation was temporary, that victory did not guarantee friendship, and that the consequences of war would stretch far beyond the battlefield. He spoke privately with his closest military and political advisors, explaining that the Soviet Union would not remain an ally for long. He said that Stalin was a man shaped by distrust so deeply that peace would always feel like a trap, not a promise. He warned that the world must prepare for an ideological struggle, not a military one, a struggle for the soul of humanity. And he said that the greatest danger ahead was the possibility that fear could once again consume the world and turn hope into ashes. Both men, standing on opposite sides of history, understood something that the world had not yet realized. That war had changed the landscape of humanity, but peace would determine its future. The Western world saw Eisenhower as a hero. The Soviet world saw Stalin as a survivor. But neither man felt like a victor. Both felt like custodians of millions of unseen graves. And in that silent burden lay the foundation of everything that would come next. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet tension that followed their meeting grew heavier. The world still celebrated unity publicly, but behind closed doors, alliances began to strain. Agreements that had once looked solid now seemed fragile, thin as glass. Friendly handshakes became cautious calculations. Diplomacy became a disguise. And without realizing it, humanity stepped into a new era. The era, later known as the Cold War, war fought without battles, but filled with danger. A war fought without gunfire, but heavy with the threat of annihilation. A war fought without movement, but defined by pressure so intense it shook the world for generations. Stalin's prediction proved hauntingly accurate. Years later, Eisenhower did step into politics, not because he sought power, but because the world demanded his leadership. People trusted him. People believed him. People saw in him a man who understood the cost of decisions. The world looked at him and saw safety in an era of fear. When he eventually became president of the United States, Stalin's warning echoed through history like a prophecy fulfilled. The man Stalin feared would shape the world did, and the rivalry between the two nations intensified into a struggle that would hold humanity hostage under the shadow of nuclear possibility. But what the world rarely remembers is the human story beneath the political tensions, the story of what one man said about another when no one was listening. Stalin did not describe Eisenhower as an enemy. He described him as a leader of rare integrity. He said that Eisenhower understood the true meaning of sacrifice. He said that Eisenhower carried responsibility like a man carrying the fallen on his shoulders. And he said that such a leader would change the world, not through ambition, but through compassion. Stalin admitted, though never publicly, that he respected Eisenhower more deeply than any other Western leader he had ever encountered. Not because Eisenhower was powerful, but because he was genuine. History often records victories and defeats, wars and treaties, triumphs and disasters. But moments like this, when the masks of power fall away, and the truth of human character breaks through, are the moments that shape the world for more than armies or weapons. Behind every conflict are men who must decide how to lead. Behind every political division are hearts shaped by fear or hope. Behind every historic event are human beings carrying burdens the world never sees. And perhaps that is why this first meeting remains so important. Because in that quiet room, two men who were supposed to be rivals recognized each other not as enemies, but as leaders carrying unbearable responsibility. They saw in each other the scars of command, the exhaustion of war, the loneliness of power. They saw that leadership is not glory, but sacrifice. They saw that history is not shaped by victory, but by the price paid for it. Decades later, after both men had left the world, historians reflected on the meeting and discovered something extraordinary in the words Stalin spoke behind closed doors. They discovered that the most feared leader of the 20th century once admitted admiration for a man who fought, not for conquest, but for peace. And they discovered that even in the darkest corners of history, respect can exist between rivals, dignity can exist between enemies, and humanity can survive inside the hearts of those surrounded by war. The world today stands on foundations built by men like Stalin and Eisenhower, foundations shaped by struggle, forged by conflict, and held together by moments of courage and compassion. The Cold War ended, borders shifted, nations changed, but the lesson remains. The greatest power on earth is not fear, not force, not armies, not weapons, but leadership rooted in understanding, humility, and respect for human life. And so, the story of what Stalin said after meeting Eisenhower is not just a story about two leaders. It is a story about the weight of responsibility, the cost of war, the fragility of peace, and the truth that even in rivalry, the world can find hope through the humanity shared between those who carry its future. Because history is not written by glory, it is written by those who carry the grief of nations and still choose to lead.